There's a strong relationship between migration and economic development and globalization. In this mini lecture video, we'll talk about three different theories that explore why people migrate and how it relates to two of the perspectives that we've looked at in this module: neoliberalism and modernization theory. Before we begin, it's useful for us to unpack some of the terminology that's used in talking about migration. Oftentimes, the words immigrate, migrate, and emigrate are used interchangeably in our society. However, for sociologists, they have different but related meanings. When we talk about immigration, we're talking about settling in a new country or region. And this is different than emigration, where one leaves their native country or land. Migrate, on the other hand, simply means to move from one country or region to another. And as we begin talking about these theories, you'll see why this difference in language is useful when talking about the movement of people and how it relates to economic flows and interconnection. Scholars from multiple disciplines have theorized why migration begins, or the initiation of international migration. Probably the oldest and best known theory is the neoclassical economic model. In its earliest form, the neoclassical economic model was a macro level theory, which, if you recall from the previous video, means we're looking at large scale structural forces. In this model, people migrate across borders due to differences in wages and employment conditions between countries. You can think of it as the supply and demand for labor. For example, consider two different countries. Country A is a poor country with low wages and poor working conditions, while country B is a much more wealthy country with high wages and better working conditions. Workers from country A move to country B because of the better wages and working conditions. And this results in the supply of labor in that original poor country A decreasing. So employers in that country are then forced to raise wages and improve the conditions. In contrast, country B, the wealthy country, experiences a labor increase due to all the migrant workers, and thus wages fall. Eventually, you end up with an equilibrium. Now, there are actions that governments can take to step into this process. But governments can control flows by labor market regulation and influencing policies in both the sending and the receiving nations. The new economics model emerged in contrast to the earlier neoclassical model. And this is a micro level theory, meaning that new economics model theorists are interested in small scale units, such as family interactions. And there's a lot of emphasis on choice and agency in decision making. The new economics model stresses the importance of household units as opposed to individual decision makers or larger structural forces like the employment sector. In this model, migration decisions are based on what's best for the family and how family labor can be split to maximize income and minimize risk or loosen constraints put on the family by the society of origin. From this perspective, families often find incentives for both international migration and local employment or production, such as farming. And they divide the responsibilities amongst various members. So the father and daughter might migrate, while the mother and son stay at home and work on the farm, or vice versa. In addition, the new economics model stresses that families are impacted by multiple markets, not just labor markets. Consider, for example, futures markets. In developing nations, there's often no futures markets that allow farmers to sell crops for a guaranteed price, meaning that all the risk associated with the harvest is assumed by the farmer. Similarly, in these nations, crops are rarely insured by government agencies. The poorest people also have little access to borrow capital, and in the event of unemployment or disability, they often have no social services or resources to aid them. So migration can be seen as serving a insurance function. They're working on the farm at home, but they've sent several members of the family or a single member of the family to another country. And if needed, that person can provide the income in the event of a failed crop, unemployment, or disability. The New Economists model actually argues that we also need to consider the impact of relative income on migration. In other words, if all members of an income group are living at a similar level, then you won't really see waves of migration. However, if just a few families in an income group have much more than the others, a trend of migration could begin. Governments can respond in this model too. They can control flows by regulating or influencing multiple markets and giving insurance policies. They can also address national income distributions. The final perspective we'll look at today is the dual labor market theory, which is another macro level theory. Here, migration is necessary due to the structural requirements of modern industrial economies. If you think of migration as a push-pull scenario, for example, limitations push people out of a nation, while opportunity pulls people into a nation, then this theory is really focused on that pull factor. We're talking about immigration here. The theory is that in modern industrial societies, there are occupational hierarchies. Some jobs are at the top and some jobs are at the bottom. And then, of course, there's some in the middle, although in this theory, it's very binary, so we're going to really just focus at the top and the bottom. The hierarchy splits the labor force into a primary sector and a secondary sector. The primary sector at the top includes skilled, professional, unionized workers. They're expensive to let go. Unskilled, labor-intensive jobs are in the secondary sector, and it's very easy to replace this workforce at any time. They're often used for seasonal or fluctuating demands, and they're thought of as expendable. In the past, the positions in the secondary sector were often held by women or teenagers. But as women have moved into more skilled position and there's been more of an extension in formal education, we have less teenagers working in factories or on construction sites today than in the past. This means that there's been a demand for immigrant labor. In addition, immigrants rarely care if there's no status to be maintained in these secondary sector positions, because the immigrant can gain status by sending remittances or funds back home. There's also little care among immigrant populations if there's an opportunity for upward mobility, because oftentimes the job is seen as just a means to an end. Thus, immigrant labor has become in high demand in modern industrial economies, and employers often find it necessary to recruit immigrant workers. Governments have less power in this theoretical perspective, and they're unlikely to influence international migration through small-scale policy. What's needed in this particular model is a major change in economic organization.